Welcome. This is James Corbett of the Corbett Report with your eye-opener report from BoilingFrogsPost.com. The cultivation of what we know today as the opium poppy goes back to the beginnings of recorded history, when the Sumerians in ancient Mesopotamia cultivated what they referred to as whole gill, or the joy plant. The practice was passed down through the Assyrians to the Babylonians, and from there to the Egyptians, by which time the opium trade had begun to flourish and was fast becoming the linchpin of international trade across the Mediterranean into Europe. Indeed, as far back as one cares to go, control of the international opium trade has always been a key factor in the rise and fall of empires. During the 18th century, the British monopolized the opium trade in India and shipped thousands of chests of opium per year to China as a way of financing their huge trade deficit with that nation. When the Chinese cracked down on opium trafficking in the mid-19th century, the British fought 2 wars to ensure their Chinese opium market. By the 1830s, American traders were already getting in on the act, with Samuel Russell's Russell and Company becoming the largest American trading house in China. Russell's cousin, William Huntington Russell, founded Skull and Bones, a secret society at Yale that has formed the core of the American intelligence establishment, a set of documentable facts that the establishment media seems eager to avoid.
The question is, to those of us on the outside, what do they do? Do they get together and have dinner together, or what is the point of this club?
Well, some say the point of the club is bonding. I look at it through the eyes of a social historian. And when you look at the grouping of people and the jobs that they have, you find a very large amount of the membership has been involved in intelligence. And then one of the most disturbing things is that the family groups have been involved in drug running since the early 1800s.
Drug running?
And it seems... Yes. The founder of Skull and Bones was William Huntington Russell, and his family business was Russell and Company, which was the America's largest opium smuggler, the 3rd largest in the world.
Wow. Chris Milligan, unfortunately, we are out of time. We're going to have to leave it at that fascinating subject, the author of a book on Skull and Bones. Thank you so much.
The association between Skull and Bones and the American intelligence establishment, from the OSS to the CIA, is well established by now, with a litany of agents, directors, and of course Director of Central Intelligence, George Poppy Bush himself, having been Bonesman before being recruited for the agency. But the connections between the CIA and the international drug trade is not simply an historical one about 19th century opium traders. Just as the British Empire was in part financed by their control of the opium trade through the British East India Company, so too has the CIA been found time after time to be at the heart of the modern international drug trade. From its very inception, the CIA has been embroiled in the murky underworld of drug trafficking. In the late 1940s, the CIA funneled arms and funds to the Corsican Mafia in return for their assistance in breaking up widespread labor strikes in France that were threatening to establish communist control over the old port of Marseille. The Corsican crime syndicate, in turn, used the CIA support to set up the trafficking network known as the French Connection, which saw heroin smuggled from Turkey to France and shipped to the US, feeding an American heroin epidemic. In Burma in 1950, the CIA regrouped the remnants of the defeated Nationalist Chinese Army, or KMT, to start an invasion of southern China and draw Chinese troops away from the Korean front. Easily beaten back by Mao's forces, the KMT instead turned their attention to occupying Burma, imposing an opium tax on all farmers in the opium-rich Shan highlands. Members of the Burmese military claimed that the KMT opium was flown out to Thailand and Taiwan on the same unmarked C-47s that the CIA had used to supply the group in the first place. In the 1960s and early 1970s, the CIA recruited the Laotian Hmong tribe to fight communist forces in the region. The CIA encouraged the Hmong to grow opium instead of rice to make them dependent on CIA airdrops of food. The agency could then force their compliance by threatening to withdraw the food aid. To make the deal even sweeter, they even located a heroin refinery at CIA headquarters in northern Laos and used Air America, a passenger and cargo airline that was covertly owned and operated by the CIA, to export the Laotian opium and heroin. Much of it ended up in Vietnam, causing an epidemic of heroin addiction amongst US soldiers. In the 1980s, the locus of opium production shifted from the Golden Triangle, where the CIA was disengaging, to the Golden Crescent, where it was engaging with the Afghan Mujahideen in their CIA-funded struggle against the Soviets. Opium became a key funding mechanism for the insurgency, and as Peter Dale Scott explained on the Eye Opener earlier this year, the correlation between CIA involvement in the region and increasing opium production was not coincidental.
I write about this in American War Machine. With the advantage of historical retrospection, we see how important the CIA was for the building up of, because it was an enormous increase initially, right after the war, of drug production in the Golden Triangle. The CIA is probably the primary reason why you saw such a dramatic increase in production. And so we have to ask ourselves, why are we now looking at the Golden Crescent, where, again, drug production increased at the same time that CIA involvement increased? They always say it was indirect through ISI, but it was still, I mean, America put billions of dollars into Afghanistan in the 1980s, and it went, the two groups, Abu Sayyaf and Hekmatyar's group, Hezb-e Islami, which were, because they were not very popular in Afghanistan, they compensated for that by using the drug trade to build up their power.
Also in the 1980s, the U.S. supported the Contras in their fight against the Sandinista government in Nicaragua. Officially barred from arming and funding the Contras by Congress, the CIA came up with a scheme to sell arms to Iran and use the funds to illegally arm and supply the Contras. CIA-protected drug smugglers flew down to Nicaragua loaded with arms to supply the Contras and flew back loaded with Colombian cocaine. A decade later, investigative reporter Gary Webb used official government documents to prove that the CIA had sheltered these drug smuggling operatives and followed the trail of this cheap Colombian cocaine to the beginning of the crack epidemic in south-central LA.
If you look at the book, I've got 70 pages of source notes. Like I said, like the series, most of the book is based on the government's own documents and the testimony of government witnesses. Now, you can argue that, well, this wasn't official CIA policy, which a lot of people have argued. I will point out that at the House Intelligence Committee hearings in March, the Inspector General of the CIA, Frederick Hitz, disclosed that there had been an agreement signed in 1982 between the director of the CIA, William Casey, and the former Attorney General, William French Smith, which allowed the CIA not to have to report incidents of drug trafficking by its agents and its assets. And I think, you know, that sort of eliminates the question as to who knew what when you've got the chief law enforcement officer of this country and its top intelligence official agreeing, sort of making a gentleman's agreement that the CIA doesn't have to tell the Justice Department when its agents and assets are drug trafficking. You've got a serious problem there.
Despite the numerous documented and fully admitted examples of CIA involvement in drug dealing in the past, the idea that the agency is still tied in with international drug traffickers is largely dismissed as the stuff of conspiracy theory. Over the last several years, however, some sensational but underreported stories of plane crashes in Mexico have served to focus attention once again on the issue of agency complicity in drug dealing. In 2004, a Beech 200 was apprehended in Nicaragua with 1,100 kilos of cocaine. It was bearing a false tail number for a CIA aircraft owned by a CIA shell company. In 2006, a DC-9 was seized on a jungle airstrip in the Yucatan carrying 5.5 tons of cocaine packed into 126 identical black suitcases. The plane's owner was linked to a company called Skyway Communications, whose CEO, James Kent, had previously held contract positions supporting intelligence projects for the DoD. In 2007, a Grumman Gulfstream II jet crashed in Mexico, carrying 3.3 tons of Colombian cocaine linked to the Mexican Sinaloa drug cartel. Later, it was revealed that the plane had previously been used by the CIA to carry out rendition flights to Guantanamo Bay. In 2008, a Cessna 402C aircraft was seized in Colombia with 850 kilos of cocaine bound for the United States. The plane's purchase history links it to a company that one ex-CIA asset has fingered as being involved in U.S. government operations. Now, the issue of intelligence agency drug dealing has once again raised its head in spectacular fashion in a rather unlikely place: a Chicago federal courtroom. The case revolves around the prosecution of an accused Mexican drug trafficker, Jesus Vicente Zambada Niebla. Zambada Niebla is part of the famed Sinaloa drug cartel, an organization that has risen in Calderon's Mexico to become one of the most powerful international drug trafficking cartels in the region, if not on the globe. His case revolves around Fast and Furious, an offshoot of the ATF's Project Gunrunner, which was ostensibly set up to stop the flow of illegal weapons into Mexico, but has in fact allowed over 2,000 guns to be smuggled under the ATF's nose into the hands of Mexican drug gangs. Zambada Niebla is in court on charges of serving as the logistical coordinator for the Sinaloa cartel, helping to import tons of cocaine into the US by land, rail, and air. The only problem is that Zambada Niebla is now claiming to be an asset of the US government. In response to this claim, US government prosecutors are attempting to invoke the Classified Information Procedures Act to keep classified material related to national security out of public court proceedings. According to a former federal agent contacted for comment on the case by Bill Conroy of Narco News, the invocation of CIPA means that CIA involvement in the case is a very reasonable conclusion, and there is hot stuff to hide. Earlier this week, I had the chance to talk to Bill Conroy about the case, and about the possible relationship between the CIA and the Mexican drug cartels.
And all of a sudden, this top guy with the Sinaloa cartel is picked up in Mexico City after he claims he was picked up right after meeting with DEA agents in a hotel in Mexico City. And the government agrees he did meet with DEA agents. Their stories kind of diverge from there. Zambada claims that he had been cooperating with the U.S. government for years, going back to, I think, 2004. And through an intermediary, another Sinaloa cartel leadership figure, a lawyer for them, whose job it was to basically get these guys out of jail and do deals for them, who is a cooperating source or an informant for the U.S. government. The U.S. government admits that, and he's been so for about 10 years. But they claim that there was no offer of any deals to any of these people. They were just helping, this particular lawyer anyway, was just helping the government out, with the hope that they would leave him alone because he had been indicted in California, but he was in Mexico and they claimed they couldn't get him. Well, we know that isn't true because they've extradited all these people up here. So whatever the case, they had a deep mole informant inside the Sinaloa cartel that the U.S. government admits, and Zambada said he was on that bandwagon, as was all the leadership of the Sinaloa cartel, that in fact they were all cooperating with the U.S. government in exchange for a quid pro quo, which says, leave us alone, tip us off if the Mexican government is on to us so we can hide, essentially don't prosecute us for our crimes. That's what they claim. The government, the U.S. government now in Chicago, the federal prosecutor handling it, says, well, that's not true at all. We never promised any blanket immunity. Zambada was never authorized to import, tons of cocaine into the United States and et cetera. And that's what's at issue in this trial, as is who's telling the truth about this. But what's already been conceded, and we've reported on it, is already, how do I say this, mind-boggling in the sense that we have the admission from the U.S. government that they had a high-level informant inside the Sinaloa cartel who, by anyone's description on both sides, was a confidant of the top guy, Chapo Guzman and Ismael, has actually met with lawyers for and with these people, has been in meetings with them, has also been in meetings allegedly with DEA and U.S. law enforcement. Of course, they don't talk about intelligence agencies in these briefings and these legal pleadings because that's classified. But the point is, law enforcement's admitted at least 20 people met with Zambada in the court pleadings. Okay, we can choose to believe who we want here, but it's pretty clear the U.S. had its fingers pretty deep inside the Sinaloa cartel. Why they didn't scoop up Chapo Guzman or the leadership, or why they didn't take the cartel down, who knows?
Despite the startling nature of the case, and the likelihood of agency complicity in drug trafficking into the United States yet again, the establishment media has been almost completely silent on this aspect of the Fast and Furious scandal, with Bill Conroy at Narco News being one of the only reporters on the beat at the moment. Perhaps this is not surprising given the shameful history of the American media in their coverage of CIA drug connections in the past. After the publication of Gary Webb's expose on the CIA Contra drug connections in the San Jose Mercury News in 1996, he was subjected to a fierce critique from the Washington Post, the LA Times, and the New York Times. The backlash eventually forced Webb's editors at the Mercury News to back away from the story. The CIA's own internal investigation by Inspector General Frederick Hitz vindicated much of Webb's reporting, but Webb remained a journalistic outcast, and the story was commonly believed to be discredited.
Charles Bowden wrote the piece 2 years ago. Gary Webb wrote a series of articles that said some bad things about the CIA and drug traffickers. The CIA denied the charges, and every major newspaper in the country took the agency's word for it.
True. And that was the strange part about it, is that we laid out a series based on a year of investigation that had buku government documents. Most of the series is based on government documents, DEA reports, FBI reports, the testimony of government witnesses. And the other papers came back with unnamed sources, mostly unnamed government sources, saying, well, this couldn't be, we don't believe it, these drug traffickers weren't as significant as Webb made out. And that was it. And at that point, the series was viewed as discredited because unnamed government sources told the Washington Post that they didn't believe it. So, I think this is an interesting lesson for the press, and I think what you've seen as a result is the sort of CNN tailwind fallout now that investigating covert CIA operations, investigating the CIA in general, is now off limits to the press, unless you have what Ted Turner called proof beyond a reasonable doubt, which when you're talking about covert operations, you're never going to find as a journalist.
In 2004, Gary Webb was found dead from 2 gunshot wounds to the head. The death was ruled a suicide. In the end, perhaps it is a simple matter of economics. There are billions of dollars per year to be made in keeping the drug trade going, and it has long been established that Wall Street and the major American banks rely on drug money as a ready source of liquid capital. In late 2009, Antonio Maria Costa, the head of the UN Office on Drugs and Crime, even went on record to say that it was primarily drug money that kept the American financial system afloat during the 2008 crisis, estimating that some $352 billion of drug profits had been laundered via the major US banks during that time. With those kinds of funds at stake, it is unsurprising to see a media-government banking nexus develop around the status quo of a never-ending war on drugs, aided, abetted, and facilitated by the modern-day British East India Company, the CIA. As presidential candidate Ron Paul pointed out during his 1988 run for the White House, it is not until the people take back their government and repeal the drug laws that artificially inflate drug prices that we can begin to actually deal with the root of the drug problem and, at the same time, remove one of the key funding sources for the CIA's illegal operations.
I don't think there's any doubt about it. I mean, it was even some of it got reported in the Iran-Contra scandals. We did know that there were drugs involved, and they were selling drugs back and forth. I think that might be the #1 reason for the drug laws. I mean, they use and play on the good people of America to support them, but I think the #1 reason is not to have high prices for some two-bit drug dealer as much as to raise the funds necessary for governments to do illegal things, whether it's some terrorist government someplace or whether it's our own CIA to fund programs that they can't get Congress to fund. I think it's tragic, and the sooner we get rid of the drug laws, the sooner this would end.
This video is part of a new weekly video news series. Future editions of this series will be available to subscribers of BoilingFrogsPost.com. For more news and commentary from James Corbett, please visit CorbettReport.com.